Oxford's rain-polished stones remember everything. A fellow falls. An anonymous letter murmurs of footsteps on empty stairs. I follow the echo, where memory misquotes, and the living prefer the dead. Where in the world are you joining me for this telling? Are you somewhere quiet enough to hear what Oxford whispers? The rain had been falling on Oxford for 3 days, not with the theatrical petulance of a summer storm, but with the patient insistence of October, as if the city's ancient stones required a particular kind of washing. Inspector Morse stood beneath the curved colonnade of the Sheldonian Theatre, watching water trace its familiar paths along gutters that had learned their business in Wren's time, and listening to the distant sound of a Bach fugue unspooling from some unseen practice room, a thread of order in the grey tapestry of the afternoon. He had been thinking, as he often did when Oxford wrapped itself in mist and melancholy, about the way buildings held memory. Not in the sentimental fashion of tourist guides with their breathless catalogues of famous footsteps, but in something more fundamental, the manner in which stone and timber absorbed the weight of human presence, the accumulation of small betrayals and large disappointments that gave a place its particular quality of silence. The staircase across Broad Street, for instance. He could see it now through the rain-blurred window of Blackwell's, presented its worn treads like an argument about time, each step a testament to the 1,000 small defeats that constituted a life in academia. The mobile phone in his coat pocket announced itself with the electronic cheerfulness that never failed to make him wince. Strange's voice, when it came, carried the particular note of administrative patience that suggested paperwork was breeding somewhere in Kidlington. Morse? Sorry to disturb your afternoon constitutional, but we've had something come in. Anonymous letter delivered to the station this morning. Typed, mannered, and... Her. Strange paused, as if consulting notes. What you might call literary. Literary in what sense? Morse asked, though he suspected he knew. Anonymous letters in Oxford tended toward the Baroque. The city's very atmosphere seemed to encourage a certain pretension in its correspondence. Well, it quotes poetry, for one thing. Footsteps were heard on the empty stairs, that sort of thing. About a death at St. Fridswide's College. Chap called Vale, died last week. Coroner called it accidental, but our correspondent seems to think otherwise. Morse felt the familiar stirring of interest, like a cat hearing the rustle of something small and significant in the undergrowth. St. Fridswide's. That's the one with the medieval gatehouse and the superiority complex? That's the one. Can you take a look? Lewis is already on his way over. After Strange rang off, Morse remained under the Sheldonian's protection for another moment, watching the rain negotiate with Oxford's surfaces. He retrieved his copy of the Times from his coat. The crossword was half finished, abandoned that morning when 7 down had proved intractable, and found himself staring at the clue that had defeated him. Echoes in Empty Chambers, 11. The answer hovered just beyond reach, like a word on the tip of one's tongue, and he experienced the peculiar frustration that came with knowing that the solution, when it arrived, would seem inevitable. He folded the paper and stepped into the rain, turning his collar up against October's insistence. As he walked toward St. Fridswide's, his footsteps joining the 1,000 others that had worn these flagstones smooth, he found himself thinking about the way sound behaved in old buildings, how it lingered in corners, how it remembered conversations long after the speakers had gone, how it sometimes returned, unbidden, to trouble the living with echoes of the dead. The college, when he reached it, seemed to regard him with the faint disapproval that Oxford institutions reserved for those who arrived uninvited. But then, Morse reflected, stepping through the medieval gatehouse into the first quad, perhaps that was simply the way all old places looked at the world, as if they had seen enough of human folly to last several lifetimes, and were not particularly interested in seeing more. I've never trusted ivy. It survives by appearing ornamental, and there is something in that which feels too close to administration. St. Friddiswides wore it in patient diagonals across stone that had seen better tempers than mine, rain having sanded the afternoon into a fine grey powder. The quad seemed to hold its breath in the way cloistered spaces do, as if the air had been trained to silence out of respect for texts older than conscience. The porter's lodge received me with that particular odor of old wool and furniture polish, the smell which suggests fewer secrets than there actually are. The log lay open on the counter, its pages ruled with an optimism that daily life never quite deserved. I asked to see the entries, and the porter, a woman with forearms you could moor a boat to and the name Pottle stitched dutifully to her cardigan, turned the book toward my curiosity. Visitors wrote their names with different kinds of vanity. One hand affected a lawyerly precision, another the swoop of a minor poet attempting immortality in a mundane register. Tuesday last showed Dr. Adrian Vale's final signature at 9:47 p.m., the ink slightly smeared as if his hand had been unsteady or perhaps simply hurried. The entry before his caught my attention, a line crossed out with more decisiveness than the lodge usually tolerated. Someone had written Hawthorne Inspection, then erased it almost to invisibility. In the margin, a small note in different handwriting, Carpet Fitters, Friday. The irony did not brighten me. If the stair had an appetite, it was polite enough to wait until the safety measures were installed. Mrs. Pottle called up a junior porter to escort me, though her eyes performed a small arithmetic with memory before she spoke. The Hawthorne was not picturesque, despite what pamphlets might claim. The stair rose in 2 short flights with a narrow landing between, geometry designed when men carried candles and women were not meant to exist. The treads had been carpeted recently in that neutral tone beloved by committees, the smell of glue lingering beneath the more institutional perfume of Brasso and resignation. There was a polish on the handrail that suggested recent attention rather than habit. I stood at the base and let my mind rehearse the accident as they had told it. Dr. Adrian Vale, poet scholar of Eliot and senior fellow, descended after a late conversation. His foot went wrong, his head met stone. The coroner's word was misadventure. The college's word was closure, a term I've never found honest, as it pretends a door where there is only a draught. At the 3rd tread from the top, I bent to examine a pale abrasion where varnish had been recently interrupted. A shoe, perhaps, finding resistance where none was expected. The skirting at the turn bore a faint smear in the shape of a hesitant hand. People steady themselves not always before, but during a fall. The mark seemed too gentle for panic. A fresh brass screw at the base of the baluster winked like a tiny, guilty star. Lionel Channing materialized in the master's study, as one might offer decent claret to a man who would rather drink whiskey. He moved within his suit as if it had been taught Latin, his memory possessing the lacquered quality of something polished to reflect only what he wished it to. The college had mourned formally, he explained with measured regret, and would prefer not to indulge in renewable grief. When I asked if he had known Vale well, he replied that knowing was too modern a word for relationships among colleagues. They had worked alongside one another. He quoted Horace with an ease that suggested neither of us would be improved by argument, the effect curiously lacquering every question I posed. Felix Mercer, the bursar, inhabited a different province of authority altogether. His collar sat a fraction too tight on a neck that had chosen pastry over principle, and he possessed the look of a man for whom arithmetic had become an ethics. He spoke of liability while I was still examining the window's rain-stitched glass. Insurance assessors had been consulted, rail heights measured, communications with next of kin were ongoing. He used the phrase "in actuality" twice within 30 seconds, which is the sort of thing one does only after recent coaching. When I asked whether Dr. Vale had raised concerns about the stair previously, he replied that to his knowledge no formal complaint had been lodged. The phrase, "to my knowledge," is clever furniture. It occupies space without inviting comfort. Juliet Rowan entered like someone who had learned decades ago how to carry her own glass without spilling a drop. Archivist, Channing said with the approval reserved for discreet women who do not attempt to be interesting. She had brought a thin pamphlet printed in the sepia economy of college presses, The Hawthorne Stair and Other Hauntings of St. Friedeswides. She placed it before me with 2 fingers, as if too much palm might compromise the evidence. The essay inside was briskly anonymous and delightfully credulous. Stories of whispering landings, cold drafts that moved against weather, boots heard descending when no one was present. One sentence caught the light. Footsteps were heard on the empty stairs. The college's own ghost story, now wearing new type in my pocket at Kidlington. I looked at Juliet and observed that antiquarian tales travel well, especially when they find new ears. She held my gaze with the briefest acknowledgement, not a challenge, but an arrangement of understanding. In the quad, Nathan Pike detained us with the smiling friction of an ambitious mind. Research fellow, modernism, with hair for the brochure and trainers too clean for genuine scholarship. He performed his party trick, speaking Eliot as if recalling rumors about someone he had nearly met. Footfalls echo in memory, he said, dropping the article with practiced carelessness. It is the memory, I corrected, and he smiled with the good humor of someone for whom truth was an accent one could acquire after a few terms. When he asked whether we were looking for foul play, I told him we were looking for peace of mind, a commodity more fragile than anyone in that quad would admit. Back in the porter's lodge, Mrs. Pottle's kettle produced a sound like an old man admitting surprise. She offered tea with milk I hadn't requested, and as the lodge cat stretched beneath the radiator with the self-respect of a small god, she let fall a memory like a child placing a smooth stone in your hand. Not the first, she said, that stair. Years back, when she hadn't the knees for mourning, a girl had gone wrong there. Quiet she was, and quiet things go missing easier. She looked at her hands as if they might admit theft. Inquiries in those days, she added, had been kept in drawers and taken out only to show the right people. Names were not for the minutes. On the pavement outside, a grey Jaguar sat with the weary elegance of money that has resigned itself to respectability. I noted the registration without meaning to. The sequence possessed a tidiness that suggested a bursar's taste. The back bumper wore road salt, despite the morning having been merely wet. Walking back toward the station, I found myself thinking about the stories that said footsteps were heard, while the new carpet disagreed. The pamphlet offered empty stairs. The college offered closure. Pike offered a line with a missing article. Pottle offered a past reduced to whisper. Somewhere between them lay a stubborn piece of stone that did not negotiate, having taken a scholar's skull with finality that left even bureaucracy momentarily shy. If there were footsteps to be heard, they were not echoes. They were the sort one makes in thought when a pattern has not yet decided itself. Jericho receives rain with more grace than the rest of Oxford, its terraces leaning in as if to share umbrellas, while the canal performs its shameless impersonation of a mirror. I found Lydia Vale's studio by the simple method of looking for the door that had no appetite for admiration, painted the color of unseasoned wood, modest to the point of argument. Inside, stone dust settled on every surface with a velveteen quality of privilege, that particular suspension of particles which suggests years spent persuading rock into more agreeable shapes. She received me with the courtesy one might extend to a necessary but unwelcome appointment, her handshake firm without demonstration. The studio revealed more about her than conversation might. Each tool occupied its designated place with military precision, works in progress covered with cloth cut to exact measurements. A half-finished figure near the window caught my attention, something emerging from limestone as if the material had simply agreed to remember what it had always contained. She noticed my interest and remarked that sculpture was the art of finding what was already there. One simply removed everything that didn't belong. When I asked about Adrian's state of mind in recent months, She paused in that way people do when translating private knowledge into public language. He had been unwell, she said, using the word with the precision of someone who understood its English implications, not physically, but in the more fundamental sense. The melancholy had deepened, and with it a certain intermittent cruelty that seemed to surprise him as much as it wounded others. His work had lately turned inward, she explained, becoming confessional in nature, drawing sweetness from old guilts like a hive extracting honey from unlikely flowers. Where once he had written about landscape and literature, his recent poetry had become uncomfortably personal, the sort of work that made readers feel they had accidentally opened someone else's correspondence. The telephone's intrusion seemed to startle us both. Lewis, apologetic as always, with information that required immediate attention. Felix Mercer's financial arrangements, it seemed, were more creative than his personality suggested. A gentle examination of the college accounts had revealed irregularities in denominations that would embarrass a church collection, small amounts but persistent, the sort of steady leakage that suggests not desperation but entitlement. Lewis's voice carried that subdued triumph of a man who has found exactly what he was looking for in exactly the place he expected to find it. More interesting still, he continued, traffic cameras had captured Mercer's Jaguar on Cat Street at 10:12 on the evening of Vale's death, though the bursar had sworn to being safely home by 9:30. The time stamp was precise, the registration unmistakable. Mercer, it appeared, had confused what he intended to do with what he had actually done, a habit common among men who spend their days arranging other people's money into more pleasing configurations. Lydia listened to my half of this conversation with the composed attention of someone accustomed to receiving difficult news. When I explained Mercer's apparent contradiction, she showed no surprise. Men like Felix, she observed, often possessed optimistic recollections when it came to their own movements. The college was full of such convenient memories. She offered tea with the automatic courtesy of someone who had learned hospitality as a social skill rather than an instinct. As she moved toward the kettle, I asked about their marriage, how long they had been together, whether they had been happy. She paused with her hand on the tap, and for a moment the studio held only the sound of water finding its level. In our beginning is our end, she murmured, as if the words had suggested themselves rather than being chosen. The possessive pronoun settled into memory like sediment. Eliot had written, "In my beginning is my end," a solitary, existential statement. Lydia had made it communal, an echo of shared fate. Our beginning, our end, the language of two lives that had learned to measure time together. It was either devotion or strategy, and in my experience, the two were not always distinguishable. I declined the tea, explaining that I needed to return to the college while the light held. She nodded and covered the kettle with a cloth, as if even this small domestic gesture required protection from the dust that governed her world. Walking back through Jericho's narrow streets, I found myself thinking about the distances we ask our bodies to travel in order to be lost. The route from the studio to St. Friedesweids was perhaps 20 minutes on foot, less by car. Long enough to plan, short enough to regret. The afternoon was darkening into that particular Oxford twilight which makes even familiar streets feel provisional. Back in the college quad, I stood beneath the hawthorn stair and looked up at the window where Adrian Vale had last seen light. The building seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something that might never come. The stair itself appeared almost modest in the failing light. 2 short flights, a narrow landing, a journey that should take 30 seconds and a lifetime to complete. I thought about Lydia's sculpture, the way she found figures hidden in stone by removing everything that didn't belong. Perhaps investigation works similarly, not by adding complexity, but by chipping away the unnecessary until only the essential remained. Yet standing there, I felt the weight of what I didn't yet understand. Mercer's creative accounting and flexible timeline, Lydia's careful studio, and careless pronouns, Vale's confessional poetry, and the anonymous letter that had brought me here. Each piece sat in my mind like stones waiting to be arranged into something recognizable. The pattern was there, I was certain, but it remained hidden beneath layers of courtesy, habit, and the particular kind of blindness that comes from living too closely with the truth. Above me, the stairs window reflected nothing but the empty sky, as if the building had learned to keep its secrets by showing only what wasn't there. The river keeps its counsel better than most people, and the perch sits beside it with the satisfied air of a building that has learned to profit from proximity to secrets. Its Tudor beams lean with the comfortable exhaustion of timber that has outlasted several centuries of confession, while the Thames beyond performs its ancient sleight of hand, appearing to flow while remaining eternally in the same place. The bar breathed of hops and oiled oak. Someone having left a copy of the Times folded to the crossword, the paper faintly softened by hands that had sought comfort in small puzzles. I had come seeking Bernard Kellow, novelist in residence with a reputation for dissecting the minor scandals of academic life. The barmaid moved between tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to collect fragments of conversation like charms. A raised eyebrow here, a significant pause there, assembling the small betrayals that constituted village currency. She possessed that particular alertness of service workers in literary establishments, understanding that being overheard was half the point of speaking at all. Kellow himself presented the curious spectacle of a man attempting to dress down to his circumstances, while his circumstances stubbornly refused to cooperate. His jacket bore the careful shabbiness of someone who had read too many novels about authentic experience, while his shoes, sensible, expensive, recently cleaned, betrayed the sort of practical vanity that suggested a man more familiar with book launches than muddy footpaths. When I introduced myself, he responded with the eager cooperation of someone who had been waiting for exactly this interruption. The hotel register lay open on the reception desk, its pages curled with the dampness that haunts riverside establishments. I glanced at it with the casual interest of a man checking the weather and discovered an entry that possessed the particular awkwardness of deception attempted by someone whose trade was the very architecture of identity. B. Kellum had been inscribed in confident script, only to have the final letter corrected the following day, the M overwritten with a W in slightly different ink, the posture of the hand more certain. A poor alias from a man who makes his living naming people, I thought. The clumsy alteration suggested not a hardened deceiver, but someone testing the waters of anonymity before deciding it was too much trouble. It was the sort of small, telling pretense that revealed more about anxiety than intention. Kellow spoke of his current project with the enthusiasm of a man who had discovered that research could be made to resemble adventure if approached with sufficient self-regard. He was investigating, he explained, the acoustics of guilt in old institutional buildings, the way confession behaved in spaces designed to contain secrets. Oxford colleges, he had found, possessed a particular resonance when it came to unspoken shame. The phrase "coming down" emerged from his conversation with the careful relish of someone who had never truly belonged to the world it described, yet understood its power to exclude. There was something in his tone that regarded human suffering not as experience, but as material, an interesting texture for his narrative loom. The mobile phone's intrusion seemed to offend the inn's studied timelessness. Strange's voice carried the particular satisfaction of a man who had found a solution that would photograph well in the local press. Headquarters, he informed me, were inclined to favor Mercer for Vale's death. The financial irregularities provided motive, the traffic camera provided opportunity, and the contradiction in his timeline suggested consciousness of guilt. Money, Strange observed, with the philosophical certainty of a man who had reduced human nature to simple equations, was motive enough for most crimes. I listened while watching Kellow pretend not to eavesdrop, his novelist's instincts warring with his desire to appear disinterested. Walking back through Oxford's familiar maze, I found myself thinking about the difference between resolution and understanding. The former satisfied administrative requirements, the latter remained elusive, hiding in the spaces between what people said and what they meant. The afternoon had acquired that particular quality of light that made even familiar streets appear provisional, as if the city were considering whether to remain itself or become something else entirely. In the college quad, I encountered Juliet Rowan crossing from the library with a manila file clasped beneath her arm. She moved with the purposeful discretion of someone who had learned to carry sensitive information without appearing to do so, her footsteps making only the smallest necessary sound on the flagstones. Our conversation possessed the careful politeness of two people who recognized they were circling something neither wished to name directly. She asked whether my investigation was proceeding satisfactorily, and I replied that satisfaction was perhaps too optimistic a goal. I was merely attempting to understand what had happened. She observed that understanding, in her experience, was often less comfortable than ignorance, particularly when it concerned the private lives of colleagues. There was something defensive in her tone, not hostile but protective, as if she were guarding information that belonged to someone else. When I mentioned the anonymous letters phrasing about footsteps on empty stairs, she merely inclined her head, acknowledging the strange echo without offering interpretation. As she continued toward the archive, I noticed the way she held the file. Not casually, but with the particular care reserved for documents that could embarrass or enlighten. Later, in the station's fluorescent purgatory, I returned to the morning's crossword with the desperate optimism of a man seeking order in a world that seemed determined to provide only questions. Empty halls, broadcast steps 4 had been troubling me since breakfast, its solution hovering just beyond comprehension, like a word in a foreign language one almost remembers. I wrote echo in the margin with the satisfaction of a man who has solved at least one mystery, however small. Yet even as I completed the letters, something nagged at the edge of consciousness. Echoes required original sounds to reflect, and empty halls, by definition, contained no footsteps to broadcast. The clue's logic was flawed, or perhaps deliberately misleading, much like everything else in this case that seemed designed to suggest one thing while meaning another. I circled the word and looked at the circle, until it became a reminder that answers are not the same as meanings. Nearly right is a location one can live in too long. The rain had returned by evening, tapping at my window with a rhythm that suggested patience rather than haste. I thought of Kello's corrected signature, of Mercer's creative timeline, of Juliet's carefully held file. Somewhere between the perch's ancient timbers and St. Fritzwide's watchful stones lay a pattern that refused to declare its shape. The footsteps that were heard on empty stairs might be echoes, but echoes of what? And in a world where novelists wrote false names only to correct them the next day, where bursars drove through Oxford at times they claimed to be elsewhere, where archivists guarded files like secrets, in such a world, perhaps the most honest sound was silence itself. Vale's rooms possessed the particular atmosphere of a mind that had ceased mid-conversation with itself. Not the chaos of sudden departure, but the suspended quality of someone who had simply stopped expecting tomorrow. The air held the ghost of apple-scented pipe tobacco, sweet and scholarly, woven into curtains that had absorbed decades of late-night wrestling with difficult verses. It was the smell of unfinished arguments with the page, of thoughts that had outlived their thinker. Juliet yielded the key with the ceremonial gravity of someone unlocking a reliquary, then withdrew like a tide that had delivered what the shore required and could now attend to more distant business. Her footsteps retreated down the corridor with the discretion of someone who understood that certain discoveries required solitude. The study presented itself as a geography of interrupted intention. Books lay, open to pages that would never be turned, marginalia trailing off mid-thought like conversations abandoned at their most crucial moments. On the desk, arranged with the precision of someone who understood manuscripts to be fragile things, lay a typescript bound with green ribbon. Stair music. 27 pages of verse that seemed to breathe with the particular rhythm of someone working through old gilts in new meters. I have spent a lifetime reading in margins, attending to the things people write when they think no one is looking, and something in the poem's architecture caught my attention with the persistence of a half-remembered melody. The first letters of each stanza, when read vertically, spelled out a name with the deliberate care of a man who understood that the most important messages are often hidden in plain sight. M-A-E-R-O-W-A-N. May Rowan. 8 letters that carried the weight of someone who had once walked these corridors before disappearing into the kind of silence that institutions prefer. Behind me, Juliet's intake of breath was so slight it might have been mistaken for the building settling, but I had learned to listen for the sounds people make when the past suddenly presents itself uninvited. Her mother, she explained with the careful neutrality of someone who had rehearsed this revelation in private, had been May Rowan, a scout in the college during the early 70s. She had cleaned these very rooms, had known the young men who were now the college's senior fellows, had died in what the records called an accident on the Hawthorne stair. Among the books scattered across Vale's reading table, one demanded attention. A well-thumbed copy of Eliot's 4 quartets, its spine creased with the affection of frequent consultation. Inside the front cover, an inscription in careful script for A.V. Footfall's echo in the memory "-LC. The quotation possessed that particular wrongness that comes from misremembering rather than misquoting. Eliot had written "Footfall's echo" in the memory without the definite article, and the punctuation was too generous, too careful. More curious still, the handwriting bore none of the classical elegance I had observed in Channing's correspondence. This was a different hand entirely, more feminine in its curves, more hesitant in its confidence, yet signing itself with the master's initials. Vale's diary lay open to the week of his death, its pages filled with the domestic archaeology of a man who recorded his life in careful increments. The entries possessed the dry precision of someone who regarded his own existence as a subject requiring documentation. But the page for the night he died had been removed with surgical precision, leaving only the faint impression of words pressed through from above. Meeting with Elle at Hawthorne. The careful omission spoke more eloquently than any confession, creating a void that demanded to be filled. I returned to the anonymous letter, spreading it flat on Vale's desk beside the poem and the diary. The afternoon light filtering through windows that had witnessed decades of similar scenes made the paper seem to glow with significance. I read it line by line, word by word, allowing my attention to settle on the small habits that betray identity more surely than signatures. The spacing was peculiar, a half space before each colon, as if the typist had learned their craft on a machine that required such adjustments. The letter S carried a slight flourish, the mark of a particular ribbon on a particular typewriter. More than these mechanical signatures, there was something in the rhythm of the sentences, the way thoughts were arranged and punctuated, that felt familiar. The phrase "footsteps" were heard on the empty stairs, sat among the letter's proprieties like a line that had traveled here from earlier company, its tone lifting as if remembering something the rest of the correspondence had forgotten. Somewhere between the fastidious colons and the careful deployment of literary quotation, a face began to turn its profile toward recognition. Not a physical face, but something composed of ink and paper, of small, deliberate choices in spacing and punctuation. It was a face that seemed to know too much, to have observed too closely, and to have decided with chilling precision what needed to be revealed and what needed to remain hidden. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it turned away again, dissolving back into the anonymous gray of typed text. The pattern was there, I was certain, but it remained hidden beneath layers of careful misdirection and the particular kind of blindness that comes from looking too hard at what you expect to see. The acrostic spelling out May Rowan's name, the misquoted Eliot with its careful misattribution, the missing diary page with its ghostly impression of a final meeting. Each element sat in my mind like stones waiting to be arranged into something recognizable. In the distance, the college bell struck 4 with the measured authority of time that has learned patience. I folded the letter and placed it carefully in my coat pocket next to the Times crossword that had yielded echo, but not yet understanding. Walking back through the quad, I found myself thinking about the way secrets arrange themselves in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right kind of attention to notice what has always been there. The footsteps I heard crossing the flagstones were my own, but they seemed to echo with the memory of others who had walked this path before, carrying their own secrets toward their own reckonings with the truth that waits, patient as stone, at the bottom of every stair. The chapel at St. Fridswide's possessed that particular quality of silence which comes not from emptiness, but from having absorbed centuries of whispered confessions. It was a hush enclosed by oak that had learned patience and stone that had grown weary of judgment, the air itself seeming to hold its breath in deference to secrets better left unspoken. Candle wax had left a discreet patina on the brass fittings, while the atmosphere carried the familiar perfume of old hymn books and furniture polish, the institutional cologne of places where souls came to be laundered. Simon Kersey stood at the organ console with the rigid posture of someone conducting negotiations with angels who had proven disappointingly literal-minded. His fingers drew from the instrument a penitential anthem that seemed to smooth the air around it, each note carefully weighed against the acoustics of absolution. The choir's voices lifted their sorrow with a discipline that felt more honest than mere piety, creating harmonies that made the mundane seem both trivial and terribly significant. When I approached, he paused with his hands poised above the keys, as if the music might resume itself without his intervention. Vale's name produced a subtle recalibration in his manner, not quite defensiveness, but the careful adjustment of someone who had learned to discuss the dead with appropriate reverence while harboring less charitable memories of the living. Vale had possessed strong opinions about liturgical music, Kersey explained with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this assessment, most of them wrong. He had been waspish about anything composed after 1930, dismissing modern settings as clever trifles, the first step, in Vale's estimation, toward perdition. There had been, Kersey mentioned with the casual malice that passes for gossip in academic circles, a rumor that Vale intended to read something at the next Founders' Feast, something he had described as unpublishable in any respectable journal. The word carried particular weight in a world where publication was the currency of professional survival. Whatever Vale had planned to reveal, it was something too personal or too dangerous for the measured discourse of scholarly review. On the music stand, a score bristled with pencil annotations, small squares, wedge-shaped accents, a private semaphore of interpretation. The graphite had been sharpened with a knife rather than a mechanical sharpener, leaving thin curls of wood and lead in the gutter of the page like stranded debris. On the reverse, a to-do list in different handwriting caught my attention. Candles, keys, fix second socket, rail height. The final entry was underlined twice, the second line heavier than the first, as if written in the moment of remembering rather than planning. Rails existed in chapels, certainly, but they existed on staircases as well. The Reverend Dr. Helena Brooke materialized in the vestry with the silent efficiency of someone who had mastered the art of moving through sacred spaces without disturbing their essential quietude. She was a woman of perhaps 50, her clerical collar worn with the unconscious authority of someone who had earned the right to speak for institutions older than nations. When I inquired about Vale's spiritual condition in recent weeks, she replied with an economy of words that revealed more than elaboration might have managed. She could not, she explained, discuss the substance of any conversations that might have taken place under the seal of confession. The professional discretion was absolute, yet something in her language molded itself around a wound she had not made. Her careful phrases suggested familiarity with a particular kind of suffering, the sort that comes not from sudden tragedy, but from the slow recognition of one's capacity for harm. When she spoke of those who sought her counsel, she began with the plural pronoun before correcting herself to the singular, a small betrayal that suggested recent and multiple consultations. Mrs. Pottle appeared at the vestry door with the supernatural timing of someone who had perfected the art of being present when information was being exchanged. She possessed that particular authority of long-serving college staff, invisible to those who mattered, indispensable to those who understood how institutions actually functioned. Her late sister, she confided, had cleaned the Hawthorne stair during the early 70s. There had been men and goings-on in those days, she said, the phrase delivered with a kindness that could not quite conceal her contempt. The euphemism carried the weight of someone who had observed behavior that fell short of institutional standards. Her sister had seen things, had known things, had taken those things to her grave with the discretion expected of women whose livelihood depended on blindness to inconvenient truths. The past, Mrs. Pottle suggested with a glance toward the altar, had a way of demanding accounting from those who thought themselves safely beyond its reach. The mobile phone's electronic insistence violated the chapel's essential nature, its modernity jarring against centuries of more measured communication. Lewis's voice carried the subdued excitement of someone who had discovered a piece that changed the puzzle's entire shape. A codicil to Vale's will, he reported, executed a fortnight before the poet's death. The document was brief, precise, and devastating in its implications. Vale's unpublished papers were not to pass to his widow, nor to the college that had housed his academic career. Instead, they were bequeathed to Juliet Rowan's discretion to be preserved or destroyed as she saw fit. The bequest carried the weight of someone who understood that certain truths required a particular kind of guardian, someone who could distinguish between what needed remembering and what needed forgetting. Another motive was born in that moment, arriving not with dramatic flourish, but with the quiet inevitability of water finding its level. If Vale's papers contained something unpublishable, something that would not survive academic scrutiny, then the power to control their fate had acquired a value that transcended monetary consideration. Reputation, legacy, the careful construction of institutional memory. These were currencies that operated according to different exchange rates than mere money. Walking back through the quad as evening settled over Oxford, I found myself thinking about the difference between confession and revelation. The former implied repentance, the possibility of absolution. The latter suggested only the stubborn insistence of truth that would not be buried. Vale's acrostic spelling May Rowan's name, his intention to read something unpublishable, his decision to place his papers beyond his wife's control, each element suggested a man preparing not for forgiveness, but for a reckoning that would outlive him. The chapel bells marked the hour with ancient authority, each note hanging in the air like a question awaiting an answer that might never come. Somewhere among the college's lit windows, I was certain, someone lay awake with the particular insomnia that comes from knowing the past refuses to remain past, that footsteps heard on empty stairs sometimes belong to the living rather than the dead. In the archives beneath St. Fridwide's, dust exists not as neglect, but as the past rendered into its most essential form. Each mote a fragment of forgotten conversations, abandoned arguments, and small betrayals that had settled into the spaces between filing cabinets like sediment in a riverbed. The air itself seemed thick with institutional memory, carrying the perfume of aging leather bindings, of paper grown brittle with secrets, and of the particular silence that accumulates in places where history is not written but simply allowed to accumulate, waiting for an eye patient enough to discern its patterns. Juliet moved through this geography of forgotten time with the assured navigation of someone who had learned to read the archaeology of administration. Her fingers found the correct box without hesitation, lifting it with the ceremonial gravity of someone handling a reliquary. The label, in her precise hand, read simply, Hawthorne Stair, Miscellany, 1970 to 1975. She placed it on the oak table between us, its surface scored with the faint indentations of countless previous inquiries, each leaving its own invisible mark on the wood. The photograph emerged from its manila envelope like evidence finally agreeing to be seen. Hawthorne Stair, 1974, had been penciled in the lower margin by someone who neither ornamented letters nor apologized for them. The image carried that particular cream of age, the emulsion having settled into its own memory of better light. Faces crowded the narrow landing with the self-confidence of youth that had not yet learned disappointment. Vale in ungainly handsomeness, already possessing that detached air of someone more interested in inner landscapes than outer ceremonies. Channing with a classical profile rehearsing future authority. A younger Mercer whose careful neatness seemed rehearsed even then, his eyes already calculating invisible sums. Near the frame's edge lurked an angular boy whose features suggested the man Kello would become, all sharp corners and watchful intelligence, as if already cataloguing the stories these faces might eventually yield. He stood slightly apart, his expression a study in practiced indifference, the pose of someone who had learned early that observation was safer than participation. The photograph's corner had been torn with deliberate precision, removing what might have been a woman's shoulder, a fragment of sleeve, the suggestion of someone who had been present but was no longer permitted to be remembered. The damage was too clean for accident, too purposeful for casual handling, the sort of editing that comes from institutional embarrassment rather than personal grief. I ran a fingernail along the torn edge and felt where emulsion had separated reluctantly from paper, leaving the faint roughness of violence disguised as tidiness. On the reverse, in pencil that had faded to the gray of old secrets, someone had written in a firm, unornamental hand, "Footsteps were heard on the empty stairs." The phrase possessed the weight of prophecy, as if whoever had inscribed it understood that these words would one day return to haunt the living. The handwriting belonged neither to the educated flourishes of academic correspondence nor to the careful anonymity of administrative documentation. It was the script of someone who wrote from necessity rather than habit, each letter formed with the deliberate clarity of institutional training. Juliet's voice, when she spoke, maintained its professional steadiness, a remarkable feat of composure given what she was about to reveal. Her mother, May Rowan, had died that year in what the college had termed a fall from the Hawthorne Stair. The official narrative was one of unfortunate misadventure, a young scout losing her footing on polished stone. But there had been whispers, she explained with the particular bitterness of someone who had inherited other people's secrets. Whispers of a pregnancy, of an older Don's impatience with complications that threatened his reputation, of a life deemed inconvenient by an institution that preferred its narratives neat and unblemished. No report had been filed beyond the coroner's brief notation. May Rowan had simply ceased to exist in any official capacity, her presence edited from the college's memory with the same surgical precision that had removed her image from the photograph. Only the whispers remained, and whispers, as Juliet observed with careful irony, were not admissible in any court that mattered to institutions like St. Frideswide's. The sound of measured footsteps on the archive stairs announced the arrival of Merton Crown, the college's solicitor, who descended with the practiced tread of someone accustomed to being summoned to discuss matters requiring delicate handling. He was a man of perhaps 60, his suit possessing that particular sheen that comes from decades of proximity to institutional power. His handshake carried the practiced warmth of someone who had learned to express sympathy without admitting liability, a skill refined through years of managing the gap between what was true and what was provable. When I showed him the photograph and explained its connection to May Rowan's death, his expression underwent the subtle recalibration that lawyers perform when presented with information that might prove inconvenient. He remembered nothing, he assured me with practiced regret, that would embarrass a now dignified institution. The early 70s had been a different time, he continued, when procedures were less rigorous and documentation less comprehensive. Tragic accidents occurred, were investigated to the extent that contemporary standards required, and were then allowed to rest in the peace that the dead deserved. His phrasing was exquisite in its evasion, not denying the whispers, but rendering them irrelevant through the gentle application of temporal distance. The past, in Crown's professional estimation, was not a matter of fact, but a matter of interpretation, a narrative to be carefully controlled rather than carelessly examined. When he departed, promising to make inquiries that we all understood would yield nothing useful, the archives seemed to exhale with relief. In the quad above, the late afternoon light had acquired that particular quality which transforms Oxford stones into something approaching gold, though the alchemy never quite succeeds. Channing materialized it with the silent efficiency of someone who had mastered the art of appearing precisely when his presence might prove most useful. He inquired about my progress with the courtesy of someone asking after a minor illness, concerned but confident that recovery was inevitable. When I mentioned the photograph and its connection to May Rowan's death, he quoted Horace with immaculate accuracy. Exegi monumentum ere perennius. I've built a monument more lasting than bronze. The quotation hung in the air between us like a challenge, its classical authority deployed to suggest that some truths possessed a permanence that transcended mere investigation. I countered with Hardy, that old melancholic who understood too well the arithmetic of memory. If way to the better there be, it exacts a full look at the worst. Channing's smile in response carried the particular condescension of someone offered an inferior vintage. Polite, but unmistakably dismissive. Hardy, his expression suggested, was all very well for those who required their truths served with sentiment, but the classics offered a more refined understanding of human nature and its necessary compromises. Walking back toward the Hawthorne stair as evening approached, I found myself thinking about the way the past arranges its own alibis. The torn photograph, the missing reports, the strategic amnesia of institutional memory. Each element had been carefully positioned to ensure that certain questions would never be asked, certain connections never made. Yet the past, like water, possesses an inconvenient tendency to find the smallest cracks in even the most carefully constructed barriers. The anonymous letter's phrase about footsteps on empty stairs had not emerged from literary imagination, but from that penciled notation on a photograph's reverse. Someone's attempt to preserve what the college preferred to forget. The handwriting was the same careful script I had observed in Porter's logs and chapel registers, the training that preferred legibility to personality. Not Juliet's educated calligraphy, not Channing's graceful flourishes, not Crown's discreet italics of legal sorrow, but the institutional hand of someone accustomed to writing names that were not their own. May Rowan had walked these corridors, had cleaned these rooms, had died on these stairs. Her daughter now guarded the archives where her mother's memory had been filed away like an embarrassing receipt. The photograph with its deliberate mutilation was more than evidence. It was a confession written in the language of institutional shame, a document that revealed more through what it concealed than through what it showed. In the gathering dusk, the college seemed to settle deeper into its ancient rhythms, its walls absorbing the last of the day's light with the satisfaction of something that had survived another interrogation. The Hawthorne stair, bathed in shadow, appeared to recede into its own history, a place where footsteps had been heard on empty treads, where lives had been lost and stories meticulously unwritten. The truth, I was beginning to understand, lay not in what was remembered, but in what had been so carefully forgotten. And in the art of institutional forgetting, St. Fridswide's College was proving itself a master worthy of its ancient reputation. Strange has always possessed the particular satisfaction of a man who can reduce human complexity to filing systems, and there are moments when I suspect he would catalogue grief alphabetically if procedure permitted. The case was assuming that agreeable shape which allows senior officers to sleep without wondering what they have overlooked. A neat parcel, as he put it, requiring only string. Felix Mercer, it seemed, was prepared to provide exactly that. The bursar received us in his office with the deflated quality of a man whose creative accounting had finally attracted the wrong sort of attention. He sat behind a desk where calculators and ledgers had been arranged with the fussy precision of someone who believed order in small things might compensate for chaos in larger ones. When pressed with the patient weight of Lewis's forensic discoveries, he admitted, though men like Mercer never quite admit, to certain liberties taken with the college's financial presentation. Not theft, he stressed, but smoothing. The figures had been adjusted to achieve what he termed better optics, a word he deployed with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed its use. Donors, he explained, preferred their philanthropy to appear prudent rather than desperate, and the college's liquidity, while robust in actuality, required cosmetic enhancement to maintain confidence. The conversation with Vale the evening before the poet's death had concerned precisely these adjustments and had been conducted, Mercer conceded, at what he euphemistically termed elevated temperatures. Vale had discovered the creative interpretations, had used words like probity and fiduciary, with the particular venom reserved for concepts one has violated. There had been threats, Mercer admitted, of exposure at the upcoming Founders' Feast, of revelations that would destroy not merely his own career, but the college's carefully maintained reputation. The optics, as he repeated with increasing bitterness, would have been catastrophic. His presence on Cat Street at 12 minutes past 10 that night, captured with digital precision by traffic cameras, was explained not as calculated return to the scene, but as panic made mobile. After the quarrel with Vale and a day spent watching auditors examine his work with the patient thoroughness of archaeologists, he had driven out simply to breathe, to escape the suffocating weight of impending exposure. He had found himself circling the familiar streets, drawn by a nostalgia he now recognized as dangerous self-indulgence. His wife, contacted by Lewis with appropriate apologies for the late hour, confirmed his anxious return shortly after 10:30. She used the word optics without apparent awareness of its significance, a small shared vocabulary that suggested either marital intimacy or careful coaching. The domestic confirmation, while not eliminating suspicion, provided the sort of corroboration that satisfies juries and closes cases. Bernard Kello, when finally cornered away from the perch's protective atmosphere, added the crucial thread that bound the narrative together. He admitted to having been at St. Fridswide's the evening before Vale's death, not merely researching atmospheric details, but actively pursuing the whispers surrounding the 1974 photograph and its deliberately obscured secrets. He had been on the Hawthorne stair itself, he claimed, making notes on the curious acoustics of guilt in old buildings when voices from Vale's room had carried with unusual clarity. Vale had been speaking of an unveiling, Kello recounted with the relish of someone whose literary instincts were finally proving profitable. Something unpublishable, he had said, something that would expose truths the college preferred, buried. Then a door had opened, and Kello claimed to have seen Mercer hurry away, his face carrying the particular fury of a man whose secrets had been discovered by exactly the wrong person. Lewis, with the forensic humbleness that characterizes the best of mid-level policing, assembled the timeline with mathematical precision. Mercer's financial irregularities provided motive. His heated exchange with Vale established escalation. His presence near the college at the crucial time offered opportunity. The sequence, he suggested with characteristic understatement, could be made to fit if one approached it with sufficient determination. Stranger's voice, when it arrived down the telephone line, carried the unmistakable departmental appetite for closure. The narrative was press-friendly. Greed, confrontation, a tragic accident born of panic and poor judgment. The public, he observed, with the cynicism that comes from decades of reducing human complexity to headlines, understood financial motive. Mercer possessed means, opportunity, and a compelling reason to silence Vale permanently. The Crown Prosecution Service would not complain about such clarity. I listened to this satisfying arrangement of facts while watching rain trace familiar patterns on the window, each drop following paths worn by countless predecessors. The solution possessed the brittle elegance of something constructed rather than discovered, each piece fitted with a sort of determination that mistakes persistence for truth. Walking alone past the college's mullioned indifference as evening settled over Oxford, I found myself thinking about the difference between solutions and understanding. The former satisfied administrative requirements and photographic opportunities. The latter remained elusive, hiding in the spaces between what people said and what they meant. A student crossed the quad carrying sheet music that fluttered briefly into recognizable notation before subsiding into illegibility. A small reminder that meaning often depends upon the angle from which one approaches it. In my coat pocket, the morning's crossword offered its own commentary. Neat arrangement conceals messy truth had yielded tidy up, but the clue's cynicism felt uncomfortably appropriate. Another entry caught my attention. Academic's final word on institutional memory. 6 letters. Thesis fit perfectly, but the word carried implications that extended beyond mere scholarship. Vale's thesis, his final academic word, had been about more than literary criticism. It had been about institutional memory and the careful editing thereof. The case, as Strange had arranged it, was indeed satisfactory. It provided a villain whose motives required no complex explanation, a sequence of events that followed logical progression, and a resolution that would allow everyone involved to return to their preferred version of normalcy. Yet standing beneath Oxford's ancient stones, I suspected the truth was better educated than simple greed, more sophisticated than panic-driven violence. The real story, I sensed, possessed the layered complexity that comes from institutions that have learned to protect themselves through careful forgetting, from individuals whose motivations extend beyond mere financial self-interest into the murkier territories of pride, guilt, and the particular kind of pain that comes from having one's carefully constructed identity threatened with exposure. Mercer might indeed have pushed Vale down the Hawthorne stair, but if so, it was not merely to protect embezzled funds. The truth, like Oxford itself, had been educated by centuries of small compromises, quiet betrayals, and the understanding that some secrets are worth more than money. They are worth the very foundations upon which respectable lives are built. The Trout received me with the resigned hospitality of a riverside establishment that had learned not to expect too much from its evening clientele. I chose a table where the Thames could perform its nightly transformation from mundane waterway to something approaching philosophy, ordered a glass of claret that promised little and delivered exactly that, and unfolded the anonymous letter with the concentration of a man who has nothing left to lose but the wrong idea. The first reading presented itself as advertised, a worried witness possessed of turn-of-the-century propriety, someone who had learned to write in institutions where language was treated as ceremony rather than convenience. The phrasing carried that particular formality which suggests education without warmth. I feel compelled to bring to your attention certain irregularities. It was the voice of someone who valued precision over personality, who understood that accusations require the protection of careful grammar. The message itself was compelling enough. Footsteps heard on empty stairs, a death that might not have been accidental, the suggestion that Dr. Vale's fall deserved closer scrutiny than the coroner had provided. It possessed the authority of genuine concern, the weight of someone who had observed something troubling and felt compelled to act, however anonymously. But first readings, like first impressions, often serve to conceal rather than reveal. I smoothed the letter against the pub table's scarred surface and began again, this time reading not for content, but for character, attending to the small unconscious habits that betray identity more surely than signatures. The spacing revealed itself immediately once I knew to look for it. A half space before each colon, as if the typist had learned their craft on a machine that required such adjustments for proper alignment. It was not the random error of inexperience, but the ingrained precision of someone whose fingers had memorized a particular rhythm, a specific dance with keys and ribbon that had become second nature through years of practice. More telling still was the behavior of individual letters. The lowercase s carried a slight flourish, barely perceptible but consistent throughout the document, not in its formation but in the way the ribbon had deposited ink, creating a subtle curve that seemed to purr on the page. It was the signature of a particular machine, a specific typewriter whose mechanical personality had been shaped by wear and use into something as distinctive as handwriting. The phrase that had brought me to this case demanded particular attention. Footsteps were heard on the empty stairs. It possessed the weight of quotation, yet I could locate no literary source for the exact phrasing. Not Eliot, despite the echo of his footfalls echo in the memory. The line felt familiar, yet orphaned, like a memory of words that had been altered in the remembering. Then recognition struck with the clarity of water finding its level. The 1974 photograph Juliet had produced from the archives, its reverse bearing that penciled notation in firm, unornamental script. Footsteps were heard on the empty stairs. The phrasing was identical, not borrowed from literature, but lifted from that private inscription, from a document that had not been in the college's public files until the archivist had chosen to reveal it. Someone with access to that photograph, someone who had seen it before its official emergence, had transformed historical notation into contemporary accusation. I finished the indifferent claret and walked back through Oxford's darkening streets toward Jericho, ostensibly to admire Lydia Vale's latest work, but actually to examine the small details that reveal more than grand gestures ever can. Her studio received me with its familiar atmosphere of stone dust and careful silence, the air thick with the particular concentration that comes from persuading rock into more agreeable shapes. Invention of Silence stood near the window, a piece that achieved the remarkable feat of making absence visible, stone carved into the shape of a held breath. The small label beside it, typed on crisp white paper and affixed with cotton thread, caught my attention with the force of recognition. The half space before the colon in medium limestone, the subtle flourish on the S in studies, the mechanical signature was identical to that of the anonymous letter. A quick glance around the studio confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Every label, every identification tag, bore the same typographical DNA. The machine that had produced the anonymous letter lived in this room, had been creating these careful identifications for years under Lydia's precise fingers. When I mentioned Eliot's line about footfalls echoing in memory, she corrected me with the unconscious precision of someone who knew the quotation intimately. In our memory, she said, then caught herself, changing our to thee, with the belated awareness that comes from recognizing one has revealed more than intended. The possessive pronoun hung between us like a confession, not the universal memory of Eliot's original, but the shared recollection of two lives that had learned to remember together. Standing in her studio while she prepared tea with mechanical precision, I found myself thinking about those footsteps that were heard on empty stairs. The hawthorn stair had been recently carpeted, its treads muffled by institutional concern for safety. What footsteps could be heard on such a surface? What sounds would carry from the landing to the rooms below? The answer possessed the inevitability of truth finally agreeing to be seen. Not the footsteps of someone ascending or descending, but the sounds of confrontation, of struggle, of a body meeting stone with finality that no carpet could muffle. The anonymous letter's author had not heard footsteps in the conventional sense. She had heard the final percussion of a marriage ending, the particular acoustics of violence disguised as accident. The letter had been her confession, typed in the careful anonymity she had learned in whatever secretarial training had taught her those precise habits of spacing and flourish. She had sent it to ensure that someone would ask the questions she could not ask herself, would notice the discrepancies that conscience demanded be noticed, would eventually trace the evidence back to its source with the methodical patience of professional investigation. Walking back through Oxford's ancient streets as evening settled over the colleges, I carried with me the weight of understanding that had arrived, not through dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of small, telling details. The truth lay not hidden in archives or buried in financial irregularities, but here in plain sight, in the mechanical habits of a typewriter, in the unconscious slip of a pronoun, in the careful construction of an anonymous accusation that was also, in its way, a plea for the justice that guilt demands, even when love forbids it. The footsteps heard on empty stairs belonged neither to the living nor the dead, but to the terrible space between, where conscience walks its solitary beat, measuring the distance between what was done and what must be answered for. The college granted permission for our reconstruction with a particular grace institutions reserved for requests they cannot reasonably refuse, but would prefer never to have received. There was something oracular about the morning's arrangement, as if the stones themselves might finally consent to speak, provided we approached them with appropriate reverence. The hawthorn stair stood in its narrow well like an instrument awaiting the proper touch. The new carpet having been removed to reveal the original stone treads that had witnessed both May Rowan's fall in 1974 and Adrian Vale's more recent descent into silence. The assembled witnesses formed a careful constellation around the base of the stair. Lewis with his notebook, Strange with his administrative patience, Channing maintaining his institutional dignity, and Juliet Rowan holding herself with the particular stillness of someone who understood that her mother's story was about to receive its final revision. At the center of this quiet drama stood Lydia Vale, wearing a dark coat that seemed to contain, rather than adorn her, her sculptor's hands resting lightly on the rail with the unconscious familiarity of someone who had touched this wood before under different circumstances. When I asked her to walk the stair, she ascended with a poise that felt borrowed from some earlier version of herself. A woman who had not yet learned the weight of what stone could accomplish when flesh miscalculated its relationship with gravity. Each step was measured with the precision of someone performing a ritual whose significance had been rehearsed in private moments of conscience. At the landing where the two short flights met, she hesitated for the briefest moment, her gaze settling on the worn stone with the recognition that passes between old adversaries. I began not with accusation, but with archaeology, speaking gently of the layers of intention that had accumulated around this narrow space. The quarrel, I explained, had been deferred rather than staged, a domestic argument that had found its inevitable venue not through dramatic calculation, but through the simple geography of a marriage that had learned to conduct its most dangerous conversations in private spaces. Vale's acrostic spelling May Rowan's name, his changed will bequeathing his literary legacy to Juliet's discretion, his planned revelation at the founder's feast. Each element had been designed not merely to honor the dead, but to diminish the living. The deeper wound lay not in public humiliation, but in private replacement. To be supplanted not by another woman, which the heart might eventually forgive, but by a mind, by Juliet's intelligence, by her connection to the buried history that had become Vale's obsession, by her role as keeper of the very archives that would preserve his moral awakening while editing out his wife's existence. Pride sharpened by such recognition makes tools of those who already possess chisels, and Lydia had spent years learning to remove everything that didn't belong from resistant materials. The meeting on this landing had possessed the terrible intimacy of truth finally spoken between two people who had shared a life without sharing its essential meanings. Vale, confronting her with the evidence of the anonymous letter she had typed on her studio machine, had demanded explanations. She had replied with the honesty that comes only when pretense has become unbearable, that some secrets grow too heavy to carry alone, that conscience sometimes requires the intervention of strangers to accomplish what love forbids. In the narrow geography of the stair, where two people could barely stand without touching, physics had collaborated with fury to produce tragedy. The push, delivered more in frustration than calculation, had misjudged the relationship between intention and consequence by perhaps an inch. The ancient stone had waited with geological patience to receive what balance could no longer maintain, and the sound when skull met limestone had possessed the finality that only such meetings can achieve. The staging that followed revealed the sculptor's understanding of space, form, and the stories that surfaces tell. She had removed the diary page recording their meeting, had typed the anonymous letter using a phrase glimpsed in Vale's research materials, had arranged the scene to suggest accident rather than intention. Yet even the most careful constructions contain their own contradictions. I spoke softly, allowing the evidence to arrange itself in the morning air, like dust finding its natural level. You wrote heard, I observed, when the new carpet makes almost no sound. You wrote empty, when you yourself were there. The anonymous letter's language betrayed not observation, but participation, not witness but presence at the scene it purported to describe from a distance. Lydia looked down at the stone that had taken her husband's head, its surface now polished clean of everything save memory. When she spoke, her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had finally reached the end of a performance that had demanded too much for too long. He was about to edit her out of the only life she knew, she said with the quiet precision of someone stating fact rather than offering excuse. Not from their marriage, which had long become a careful partition of separate territories, but from the narrative of his intellectual awakening, from the story he intended to tell about his moral courage in confronting institutional silence. She would keep the house and furniture while he placed what mattered most in the custodianship of another woman's daughter. When Channing spoke of police procedures and formal charges, she glanced once at Juliet with something that might have been apology or recognition, then passed her to the staircase that had become both scene and confession. The look carried the weight of someone who understood that certain stories, once begun, must reach their natural conclusions regardless of the cost to those who must live within them. It might have been enough to live, she said, the conditional tense carrying all the weight of roads not taken and choices that could not be unmade. The phrase hung in the air between us like a small, perfect sculpture of regret carved from the morning's silence. Had he not preferred the dead, she continued, the words arriving without emphasis, but with the terrible clarity of someone who had finally found language for a wound that had festered too long in darkness. The college would survive this scandal, as it had survived countless others, its stones absorbing one more story into the vast archive of institutional memory. The Hawthorne stair would be walked again by students and fellows who knew nothing of May Rowan or Adrian Vale, their footsteps adding to the accumulated weight of all the lives that had passed this way before. But in that moment, standing on the landing where two lives had reached their intersection with gravity and consequence, the only sound was the whisper of truth finally agreeing to be heard, not in the anonymous letter's careful accusations, but in the confession of someone who had learned too late that love and murder are sometimes separated by nothing more than the width of a single step, the span of a moment's misjudgment, the terrible precision with which stone receives what flesh can no longer bear to carry. Figment of an Oxford morning, conducted with the discretion that institutions reserve for their most embarrassing necessities. Lewis managed the formalities with his characteristic gentleness, understanding that dignity, once surrendered in such circumstances, rarely finds its way home. Lydia accepted the caution with the composure of someone who had rehearsed this moment in private hours, her sculptor's hands steady as they were guided behind her back, her gaze fixed on some middle distance that offered neither accusation nor absolution. Strange expressed his satisfaction in the measured tones of administrative relief when he rang later that morning. The papers would speak of domestic tragedy rather than institutional scandal. He observed, with the particular contentment of a man who understood that public narratives require careful cultivation. The phrase possessed the comfortable weight of the familiar, containing the messiness of human passion within bounds that readers could comprehend without discomfort. The college's reputation would absorb this wound as it had absorbed others, its ancient stones adding one more story to the vast sediment of institutional memory. Yet even as the official narrative assumed its agreeable shape, smaller rectifications began to make themselves known. In chapel that evening, Mrs. Pottle's sister's name was spoken properly at last, not merely as part of the general intercession for all those departed, but as May Rowan, identified and remembered. The chaplain's voice carried the correction across centuries of accumulated prayer with the authority of someone finally permitted to acknowledge what had always been true. Mrs. Pottle stood in the back pew with her hands folded, her expression suggesting that some victories arrive so quietly they might be mistaken for ordinary moments. Channing, with the swift decisiveness that marks successful administrators, approved the publication of Vale's acrostic poem in the college's literary journal. His accompanying note from the master's loggia spoke of healing and the necessity of confronting difficult truths, though the language possessed that careful ambiguity which allows institutions to acknowledge wrongdoing without admitting liability. The poem would stand as Vale's final contribution to scholarship, its author's memory rehabilitated through the very revelation that had precipitated his death. Juliet said nothing during the brief ceremony that transferred Vale's papers to the college archives, but her silence carried more weight than speech might have managed. She placed the original typescript among the other documents with the reverence due to something that had cost more than its creator could afford, then opened a leather-bound ledger and wrote the word "Mother" beside the accession date. The entry was small, unremarkable to any casual observer, yet it achieved what decades of whispered speculation had not. It made May Rowan's existence a matter of official record, preserved in the same archives that had once conspired to forget her. Bernard Kello departed the perch under his own correct surname that afternoon, his brief experiment with literary alias having yielded less of a sensational story than he had hoped and more of a conscience than he probably deserved. His novel he had confided to the barmaid who collected his confessions along with his empty glasses would require substantial revision. Fiction, he had discovered, possessed neither the courage nor the cruelty of actual events. As evening settled over Oxford with its familiar alchemy of gold light and gathering shadow, I found myself standing in St. Fridswide's quad, watching the Hawthorne Stairs window darken from the top down, like an eye slowly closing on what it had witnessed. The building seemed to exhale with the satisfaction of something that had finally told its secrets, though whether from relief or exhaustion remained unclear. In the gathering dusk, I allowed myself the dangerous luxury of thinking about Juliet Rowan, her intelligence, her self-sufficiency, her way of moving through the world as someone who required neither completion nor rescue from external sources. She possessed that quality I'd always found both attractive and terrifying in women, the ability to exist completely within herself. It was precisely the sort of emotional unavailability that my nature found irresistible, the promise of a sophisticated ruin. Yet she was not the woman who would offer me such destruction, and I was not the man who would accept it. We were both too practiced in the art of quiet endurance. The mobile phone's electronic intrusion scattered these thoughts like leaves before wind. Lewis, calling from Kidlington with the day's final administrative details, reported that Mercer's creative accounting would be made to balance after all. The college's auditors had discovered irregularities that fell just short of criminal prosecution, requiring only restitution and the sort of quiet resignation that allowed institutions to preserve their reputations while disposing of their embarrassments. The bursar would depart for a position at a less prestigious establishment, his references carefully worded to suggest competence without enthusiasm. From a student room somewhere above the quad, opera leaked into the evening air, tentative Puccini performed by someone who understood the melodies but had not yet learned to trust them. The music possessed that quality of hope attempting to convince itself, of beauty emerging despite the singer's uncertainty about whether beauty was deserved. It seemed appropriate accompaniment to a day that had seen truth finally emerge from the careful arrangements that had hidden it. I turned to leave the quad, my footsteps echoing briefly off the surrounding walls before being absorbed by the forgiving darkness. But as I reached the gatehouse, I paused to listen once more to the sounds the college was prepared to permit after a day of uncomfortable revelations. Not footsteps on the hawthorn stair, not the whispers of conspirators, not even the guilty silence of those who had preferred certain truths to remain buried. Instead, there was only the small, obedient creak of old wood settling into its accustomed positions, the gentle protest of timbers that had supported the weight of centuries and would continue to do so long after the current generation of secrets had been replaced by new ones. It was the sound of a building deciding nothing, accepting everything, continuing to exist with the patient indifference that allows institutions to outlive the individuals who inhabit them. Walking through Oxford's darkening streets toward the station, I carried with me the satisfaction of a case resolved and the melancholy that comes from understanding that resolution and justice are not synonymous. The footsteps that had been heard on empty stairs belonged now to memory, their echo fading into the vast archive of sounds that old buildings collect and occasionally, when circumstances align properly, consent to reveal. It was enough, I reflected, that the stairs were there and empty, waiting for whatever footsteps the future might bring to trouble their ancient peace.